Can you imagine being the reason that someone leaves Islam? Like, could you actually imagine on the day of judgment having to explain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala why someone left Islam because of things that you used to say or repeatedly do? Assalamu alaikum. If you're new here, my name is Hannah. I am a trauma coach who works with Muslim women, and I help Muslim women heal from complex trauma and build a beautiful life ahead of them. So if that's something you are interested in, then you can go to the links in my description to learn more about my trauma group coaching program, or just to get my webinar on the 3 steps to healing complex trauma. This is a topic I've been wanting to talk about for a while because I think it's a topic that's so important for us to discuss in the Muslim community, and one that we often neglect. I want to start off by sharing a story, and I will connect the story to this topic a little later on. But there was a Sahabi named Mu'adh ibn Jabal, and Mu'adh loved the Quran and he loved his Salah, and he used to enjoy the recitation of very long surah. The Mu'adh was sent to actually kind of lead the people of a distant area from Medina. And one day he went back to this area, and in one of the salah, he decided he was going to recite Surah Al-Baqarah. Now this, I believe, was Salat al-Asha. And the recitation went on for so long that someone ended up actually leaving the salah, like stepping out of salah. And the Mu'adh was critical of this man, as you can imagine. You walked out of salah in congregation. And the news actually reached the Prophet ﷺ. Now, what do you think the Prophet ﷺ's reaction was? That, it's the Quran, this man shouldn't have left. The fact that you chose to recite a long surah is so beautiful. No worries, you get reward for it, and everyone who stood there got reward for it. Actually, the Prophet was pretty upset. He actually scolded Mu'adh ibn Jabal and stated, you put them to trial. You put them in a situation where their Iman was going to be tested. Why did you do that? And the Prophet ﷺ actually advised Mu'adh that in the future, you should actually choose shorter surah, choose smaller surah, so that people don't get frustrated, so that they don't have this negative, sense or experience in an act of worship. How does this connect to religious trauma? We'll talk about it, but let's define what religious trauma is. Religious trauma and spiritual trauma are often used very interchangeably, but it's essentially the use of religious beliefs, ideology, scripture to abuse, whether it's used as, to promote physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and to cause emotional, mental, and physical or spiritual damage. Religious abuse is not something uncommon. It is actually absurdly common. I cannot tell you how many women I have worked with and coached, how many individuals have commented on my Instagram or on my YouTube channel, speaking of religious trauma they experience. And I want to split this video into 2 parts where we talk about why this is so damaging, calling out the folks that are doing it, and you might even be doing it and not even realizing it, and then for those who experience it, what you can do to heal from it. Number 1, Islam is perfect, and Islam is a means of guidance for us on this earth. And when you use something so perfect and so beautiful as a tool of manipulation, you are literally doing the work of shaitan. You are doing the work of taking something that is meant for our mercy and our safety and our protection, and actually using it for your own personal inclination. And religious trauma can look like a lot of different things. For example, it can look like overburdening someone with religious ideology. It can look like using religious ideology to promote or justify your abuse. Often we see this with parents who abuse their children and then use verses like, the verses are on bir al-walidain and, ihsan to our parents, to promote that or to justify it. We see it in marriages where husbands will do this to wives, and sometimes wives will do this to husbands, where they're utilizing these religious texts to actually try to cause harm. And part of why that is so damaging and so actually very scary for you to do, and it reflects a level of spiritual damage to your own heart if you're the one who's using these tools as abuse, is because it's not about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not about getting people to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not about getting people closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's about getting people to do your bidding, to fall in line for what you want, and to make things easier on you. Because if it was truly about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you would go about it in a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sanctions, in the way that the Prophet ﷺ showed us. That if you were trying to correct someone, for example, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you wouldn't do it by using sin, by cursing them out or insulting them or physically hitting them. Right? You wouldn't do that. If you truly cared about someone's Jannah and their Akhirah, you wouldn't belittle them. You wouldn't try to punish them in ways outside of what Islam ever permits. It's just frustrating when I think about it, because we should have ghira of our deen, that when people try to use our deen for harm, we should be able to call it out immediately. And it is far too common to be able to overlook. What ends up happening as a result is two things that I have seen. Number one is that people just disconnect from deen. If they don't know any better and they don't know much about their deen, they may think that deen, the religion of Islam, is that which they have been taught. And if they have no other exposure, perhaps they don't know how to read the Quran or understand it, they don't have teachers, perhaps the teachers or the scholars in their community actually sanction this type of abuse because it is culturally considered appropriate, they might never know that this is not Islam. And then they end up leaving Islam, trying to seek something to fill the role that Islam was going to fill in their lives. And guess who gets part of the punishment and the blame for that? The person who abused, the person who pushed them away from deen. This is why I brought up that story, is because you would think that, well, if someone is doing it, we all have the responsibility to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have the responsibility over our deen. Absolutely. We all have our own personal responsibility to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to abstain from sin, to do good deeds, to make tawbah when we do wrong. 100%. But at the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recognizes the contributions of other people for or against that, right? In the same way that the Prophet ﷺ was upset at Mu'adh for doing something that is a good deed. Reading Quran is a good deed. Reading long surah and spending time in contemplation and reflection and salah is a good deed. But it was a difficulty on the people of the congregation and affects their iman. Not everyone is as strong to be able to stand there for an entire rak'ah of Surah Baqarah. That can be very difficult on someone. So if someone is being held to account and scolded by the Prophet ﷺ for doing something that was good, that was khair, that caused harm, what say you about people who do things that are actually harmful, sinful, wrong? I know of a situation in which a parent was so angry about something that their child did that went against their wishes, something that was actually completely halal, completely within their right. There was no sin about it. This person discussed it with scholars and said, essentially, you wronged your parents. Allah is going to punish you for that, and I am never going to forgive you. Who do you think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's side is going to, who do you think Allah is going to take? Like, whose side do you think he's going to take? The person who did what was in their right, got the scholarly consent for it, did what they thought was best for their dunya and their akhirah, or the person who's trying to abuse and manipulate the verses of the Quran, who actually don't understand what the rights of parents are, and actually are using that to hold over their child's head and emotionally blackmail and emotionally harm, and say they're not going to forgive you, despite forgiveness being one of the highest virtues of our deen. Whose side do you think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to take? I don't need to say anymore. Religious abuse, right? Religious trauma that comes from religious abuse is a problem. And while one group of people may find themselves distancing themselves, there's another group of people who actually find themselves coming closer to deen. And that is a blessed place to be. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the more we are able to acquaint ourselves with this religious trauma, religious gaslighting, and what it actually looks like, the more we're able to actually stop it, start setting boundaries around it, and also being mindful, are we contributing to it? If we were raised in a certain way where religious abuse and religious trauma was commonplace, we might not even realize that we've adopted those same tendencies or those same ways of speaking or thinking about things that we then pass on to our children or, younger family members or our friends or, if we have a certain influence on the community. So it's so important to be mindful of that. If you've experienced religious trauma, religious abuse, how do you heal from that? This is a topic I really enjoy. First and foremost, something as beautiful as Islam, it is healing. It is healing in and of itself. And so the first big piece of advice I have for someone who has experienced religious trauma, learn the deen for yourself. If you are finding yourself constantly broken, constantly sad, and constantly angered by the way, and it seems like there's contradiction and hypocrisy in the way that people are putting forth the deen and trying to use it against you, you have to take matters into your own hand and learn deen for yourself. Now, this doesn't mean sitting there and, popping open a translation of the Quran and interpreting it for yourself. There's actually a very scary hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, he who interprets the Quran, let him take his seat in the hellfire. Meaning, that's a very dangerous game to play. We have scholars who are trained in this, and they put out the knowledge and the information for us to be able to understand and consume. And so finding the scholars who you find to be authentic, genuine, non-hypocritical, learning from different ones, taking note of what are the themes that are coming up is going to be really important. When you come to an understanding of your deen, there's empowerment there. So when people tell you something like, oh, well, this is haram, you're going to hell for this, you can stop and be like, well, actually, like the Quran says this, or the principle is this, and you can counter that. If it's making you, if things, people are telling you things, and sometimes they're right, and they're just going about it in the wrong way, right? If people are telling you, for example, conversations around hijab, and you're being insulted and ridiculed and mocked and just dealt with in a way that is not the Islamic way, it might be that they are right, that they're trying to, in their mind, they're advising you towards proper hijab. Their approach might not be proper, or it might be actually traumatizing and abusive. With that being said, when you're empowered with the knowledge, you know what hijab actually is. I'm giving this as an example of fiqh, right? Then you can come to that on your own, from your own understanding, and apply it without having to falter under the influence of their abusive words or actions. That's number one. Number two, building up an authentic, connected relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so important, because Allah doesn't abuse, because Allah is most just, He is most merciful, He's loving, He is protecting, He's Al-Wali, He's Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Qadir. Getting to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows you to experience that level of peace where when people are trying to throw off that contentment in your heart when it comes to deen, you have a solid place to land because your relationship with Allah is strong. So you realize that the relationship they're trying to get you to have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not one that you want. You don't want one where you feel like you're constantly being bullied into certain behaviors or certain actions. You want one where you do what you do out of love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of care for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the highest level of what you can do. Your actions. You can do things out of fear of hellfire. You can do things out of, wanting Jannah. But the highest level of taqwa is the willingness to do things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is so healing to be able to experience that, to have that, to be able to just tune out the noise of what you're experiencing and move forward. The next piece is really connecting to dua, right? It's just dua. I actually posted this on Instagram, but dua can be used as a trauma integration technique. I had a client who used dua as her trauma integration technique. It's so easy for us to hear dua, make dua, and automatically we think, well, what's that going to have to do with abuse, or how is that going to help me with abuse? But dua changes our physical state. It literally rewires your brain, and it changes your metaphysical state. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when answering a dua, is shifting things in the metaphysical world so that your dua can be answered. It's so incredible when you actually think about it. Using dua is really, really powerful. The final piece of advice that I would give you is there are sometimes some really horrible experiences that can be very triggering. Right? People who are abused, individuals who are, for example, forced into marriages being told that they have to listen to so-and-so because it's required, even though that is a complete and utter sin. The nikah contract is not valid if someone is forced into it. It can be extremely traumatic, and trauma integration is necessary for those instances. When you have traumatic experiences or memories that are kind of stuck inside of you and your nervous system is constantly reacting to it, that needs to be integrated. What does that mean? We need a method to be able to rewire that memory and send it into long-term memory where it no longer elicits a nervous system response. If I'm talking about nervous system and you have no idea what I'm talking about, I have a series on healing trauma. It's called the Healing Trauma series. Go watch those because we talk about all the basics of trauma healing, trauma integration, nervous system, all that good stuff. And it's a really good foundation for you to have. Trauma integration methods look like a bunch of different things. You can try EMDR, there's hypnotherapy, there's brain spotting. I use 4 different trauma integration methods in my trauma group coaching program for my clients. So there are several, but finding someone who's able to support you in that and actually help you integrate that trauma is so important, because once we offload that from the nervous system, you'll be less reactive, you'll be happier, you'll be less anxious, because you've stopped giving your nervous system something to have a stress response to. And that's what trauma is. Trauma affects the nervous system at the core level and constantly puts it in the state of fight or flight or disconnect or survival, right? So those are my pieces of advice. I'd love to hear from you what other pieces of advice you would give to someone who has experienced religious trauma. As I mentioned in the beginning, if you're a Muslim woman who is looking to heal from trauma, go to the links in the description. Just check out the programs and what they have to offer. Inshallah, we are taking clients for January 2025 of our group coaching program. And I will see you in the next one. Like, subscribe if you haven't. Assalamu alaikum.